Hello, it's Trekker Joe, and I am here to give you a PID tutorial. And yeah, I'm actually in the designer. This isn't like a post-processing thing. So yeah, so I've seen a lot of people talk about how they struggle with PIDs, and I've had people tell me how I am so good with them. Now, of course, uh, like in order to answer your questions and to help you guys get an idea of how to actually tune these things, I had to go and research it a bit. I went like 2 nights ago. I had spent way too much time, like past midnight, just experimenting with the PIDs. And then uh, yesterday, I looked it up on Wikipedia, so now I am armed with at least a vague working knowledge of the specifics so that I can actually communicate to you guys how I do it. Now, of course, the funny thing is with PIDs, there are a couple things you need to take care of before you can even use it, and I know it's extremely obvious, but the thing that you need to put together is the craft itself. You actually need to be very mindful of how they're built. So I'm just going to raise this up and start placing jet engines. Now, PID systems will work best when you have your jet engines evenly spaced. Now, you might be thinking that this is okay and the bare minimum for jet engines. Well, I mean PIDs in general, you do need at the bare minimum 4, because you basically need to have altitude and then 2 axes of travel, and so for that you need 4 jet engines. And I believe there are ways to get away with just 3 if you use a script. I haven't tried that, and I don't know if that's even PID stabilization. But yeah, anyway, so we have our jets in here, took care to make sure they're centered around center of mass. So now we just go over how we outfit these. The jet engines in the front are just going to be in thruster control mode. Don't need to change it. Even if they're upside down, you don't need to change it. Now for these are your roll control. And so set these, you probably already know how, because, I mean, you're watching this channel, you probably already set up a thruster craft before, so that should be common knowledge. But here's one thing that I did get a little confused about, and even if you have 2 of these, like have it on the top and bottom, in fact, up here, just as an example, these are still thruster control mode. Anything in front of the center of mass is going to be in normal thruster control mode. Behind center of mass, it's always going to be in thruster reverse. So that's something to note, and that doesn't matter. Like that doesn't matter with the orientation at all. Also, same thing for steering thrusters. If it's behind, it's always going to be reverse unless you, for some reason, want reverse steering. But yeah, now I'm placing down my PIDs, and I'm just going to set this to roll. I'm going to set this one to pitch. I'm going to set this one to... I'll set this one to altitude in a moment. But basically, for this, test stimulus, you always want test stimulus for altitude, and this is basically the offset. Since I'm setting it to 25, it's going to try to stay 25 meters above the water. So I'll set that to altitude and let go, and it should be very unstable, but it'll at least settle at the right altitude eventually. In fact, it appears that it is able to do that. So one thing to note, when you're tuning a PID, basically you have these 3 terms. you have your gain, which is the p-value. This is basically the amount of force it is allowed to use in response to a change in, and in this case it would be a change of height, but it could also be the change of angle. The integral time is basically, this tries to cancel out the change after a while, and basically eliminate steady state error, which I will actually talk about that as well. And derivative time is basically, it applies force proportional to the amount of error. Basically, it's like saying, predict into the future, like after this change of altitude, how, if it continues at its current rate, how much of a difference would that be in this amount of time, and then it corrects based on that. Basically, it's to anticipate error and to adjust to prevent drift. I'm going to turn it all off, except for this. So what should happen here is it's going to fall until it reaches a point where it starts to oscillate between altitudes. It'll eventually settle. So that's just because of the force of gravity holding it down. But yeah, this, we have it set to 25 meters, but it's actually staying at 21 and 22 meters. And this is the steady state error I am talking about. This is the steady state error. This is basically keeping at a certain level of altitude, but in order to actually be applying force, it is taking the fact that it has error and then using that to power the thrusters, keep it airborne. And since we don't have any integral time, it isn't going to try to cancel out this error, meaning that it's just going to float here forever. And I think because our roll is too powerful, it's going to stay there. So we actually do want an integral time. And setting this to a low number is good. Let's set this to 1 second. It'll try to cancel the difference in about that time. And then once we have settled into our spot and we stop getting oscillations, which it does appear that it's, even at this setting, it's still too powerful because we have quite a bit of overshoot, which we can actually remedy with this value. It doesn't appear to be stable actually. So this is where we get our derivative time. Let's just try giving a slight amount of derivative time. If it's a small number, it should be relatively fine. For lightweight craft, if you have plenty of thrust to weight, or thrust to mass in this case, you can have this be slightly longer than its integral time, and it will balance out quite nicely. Because this is, again, like predicting where it's going to be at a certain point. And this is how it works out. So it will eventually settle, but because we are not roll stabilized properly, it's going to have trouble. Let's do the same thing. Let's remove the integral time, remove the derivative time. Let's just reduce the gain. And as you can see here, it's kind of a pendulum. If I caps lock this and get it perfectly the right altitude, which that's going to overshoot a bit since I held it in place, what will happen is it'll eventually start to drift in a direction. In fact, I can actually speed that up a little bit. Also, it's still like bugged. I can speed that up a bit by just standing in a corner, because character does technically have weight and it affects craft. But what should happen is eventually the craft is going to start moving. In fact, it's actually moving in the opposite direction. This is again the steady state error I'm talking about. If for roll and pitch, you absolutely must have something in the integral time, otherwise it doesn't work. Again, in this specific case, setting it to 1 second helps, although it is creating an oscillation. So we can stabilize that oscillation again by adding the prediction in, and it'll basically act against the extra force of the thruster and cause it to stabilize. I think if I increase this gain, it should actually settle a little more easily, because what I think is happening is it's not actually applying enough force to stay at the right altitude. So I'm just going to let this oscillate a little bit, but it will settle unless I'm wrong, in which case I will have to come back to this. But nope, in fact, increasing the gain on that seems to have stabilized it. That's another thing to note, is you want it to solve its error in a quick amount of time. And in this case, I want it to do that in 1 second, which is why the integral time is 1 second. I'm just going to place a lead beam. As you can see, it doesn't recover at all. The pitch is way too unresponsive. And roll also seems somewhat unresponsive. But it will recover eventually if it doesn't crash, like it just did. One thing I'm not taking into account is that in my other tests I also had thrusters on top, which does improve the stability quite a bit. Since I'm only using bottom thrusters for this, I actually need higher gain because of the lack of extra thrust. So I'm going to add this. Now let's just see. You would think pitch would have oscillations, but it doesn't. Just roll. So I am getting small oscillations here. So what you should do in this case is make the gain half of the value if you increase it slightly. So in this case, that should have stabilized it. I'm also going to try doubling the gain here. Okay, double the gain again. That's 4. So the gain here can be at 0.02. Again, this is how you would professionally tune this. And it does appear to be recovering very quickly now. I'm still surprised that pitch doesn't have oscillations. And I'm also going to try experimenting with this. So 2, do we have oscillations? No? Let's just move it to 100, and as you can see, we are actually getting increasing oscillations here. So we can cut this back to 0.05, and aside from like the slight spikes if we get outside of range, which is perfectly okay to me, this thing will not have any oscillations. It's going to settle on the correct altitude very quickly. And so if I were to weigh it down again, let me just cut that off. As you can see, it isn't able to recover still. Now this is because our system isn't responsive enough. So one way we can fix this, let's start with roll. One way we can fix this is reducing this number. So we want, because again, it's basically reducing the setting time well, actually increasing it when this number is high. So what we need is to decrease that settling time. Otherwise, we're going to have trouble. So let's set this to 0.01 and see. Do we have oscillations? We do have oscillations, but it's going to stabilize. That's good, but because of these oscillations, I may raise this value to help counter the oscillations a bit. That's not promising. Also, setting this too high cannot result in problems. So right now I have it set to 2, which is creating a consistent linear oscillation. I'm going to reduce this and get it close to the point where it causes oscillations. It appears that this setting is the right setting. I'm going to set it to 1.80 because I'm concerned that there are actually micro oscillations occurring, which are completely invisible to the naked eye, but yeah. Speaking of which, I'm actually tuning it better now that I had looked this up. So that's cool. So I'm just going to place one, I don't know, on this corner, wait a couple seconds. In fact, this thing should actually... Oh no, it can't. So I'm reducing that. I'm removing that. It should actually settle again. And it appears we do have additional roll. So we, with this, can't really do anything about this. Can we? For pitch, I might have to do something similar. So okay, this time it actually properly adjusts, and it's because my pitch was so off. But this thing doesn't actually have the ability to properly stabilize itself because it doesn't have the amount of thrust it has. It should have. It should actually be pretty much perfectly stable here. Altitude is the only thing that takes a while to settle, but that's okay. Should probably adjust pitch. Yes. Getting these periodic oscillations. They are decreasing in frequency, but I don't think they're working. Let's set this to 1.8. We should probably still be getting errors. 2. Well, that's just 1. That's when it ended. I'm going to make it 1.1 just to be safe. So that should technically help with this. And it might be able to recover this and actually stay upright if I gave it time. But it depends on if it can actually stay at its right angle, at the correct angle. It appears to be taking time to actually settle, but should, if it can provide enough thrust, which it doesn't appear to be able to. Actually not at all, it's definitely not able to settle with this much of an offset, but it is staying at the correct altitude at least. It's just its pitch isn't actually improving. So I'm going to remove that and let it rebalance itself. And again, because of the derivative time, it is going to oscillate a little bit as it is it had adjusted to try to eliminate the error caused by the extra weight. This platform really isn't stable enough. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up another platform, but I'm going to set it up a little differently because this version of the platform is less stable than the other example that I plan on using. But either way, when it is by itself and not being like weighed down by some external forces, it is actually perfectly stable. Okay, so I have my platform. Also, I never actually set this. So I have my new platform, and you should be able to immediately tell that this ship has a lot more thrusters. In fact, you can probably also tell that you could get sick looking at this. So I'm just going to caps lock it right here, where it should be relatively stable anyway. If I release it, it's going to oscillate. That's because the default settings do not play nice with it. So the neat thing about this is having the thrusters on the top as well as the bottom makes your craft so much more stable. It means your craft can actually properly handle extra loads. Unlike that one, which only has thrust on the bottom, it can only ever really support itself and what it's set to. This thing can more handily adapt. And I will go and change its settings real quick. You probably don't need to see me go through the process. In this case, I can use a lower gain because these things have way too much gain for the extra thrusters it has. And I'll be right back. In fact, altitude can actually stay where it is, because having the altitude gain actually being being higher is okay, because in this case you want it to react strongly, and it still has the same amount of thrusters maintaining the altitude. But yeah, I'm going to... Oh, also, reducing the gain actually has removed the oscillations. That's good. I'm going to continue to configure these, and I'll be right back. Okay, I have gotten this thing set up, and I'm about to demonstrate the advantage of having the top thrusters. Now this is actually a lot more floaty. I have it on very floaty settings. The integral time is pretty long, so it takes a little longer to settle. But even with that, because of the extra thrusters it has, it technically reacts faster and even better than that one. It doesn't enter into oscillations when it has a massive change in weight. And as you can see, I just placed a piece of lead on it, and it's fine. Let me place another. Still adapted. It's actually... Now it's struggling a little, but it is still in the air, and in fact, pretty much stable enough for combat still. Let's add a third one. Okay, this is where I would think we'd start getting trouble, but it's still barely using the engine. Okay, I'm actually curious now. Let me just add another. Really? It is still keeping itself airborne. Now, part of the reason for this is because it has these upwards thrusters. Without them, the craft would tilt over easily. That's just kind of important to note, is it significantly improves the maneuverability of something that has a large amount of weight. I'm just going to remove that, and it's going to recoil a little, but then it's going to fairly quickly settle back into its correct altitude and position. Now I'm going to go through my next example and actually go through the tuning process for a very heavy craft. So I'll be right back when I have that ready. Let me just put this on for you. Set this to altitude. Engines don't even cut it. Come on, come on. Oh, we just barely got there. Okay. A platform like this is actually nearly impossible to balance, and especially with the way we have it set up. There would be a couple things I would do to this, but the biggest thing is increasing the gain to maximum for the game, because we do actually use a lot of it. There's a little bit of oscillation, but that's only because it is trying to settle into its place. When it's actually settled, it's fairly smooth. Actually, if I look at this, I still am getting micro oscillations, so I'm going to set that to about half as per the things. Now I have done this, tried to do this before in another version of the tutorial, so yeah. I also need to increase the gains massively for both of these, because what's going on with these is the fact that it's not actually properly applying enough force nor stay up. So we have this. I'm going to remove the integral time. I'm going to remove the derivative time. Let's just see what altitude we wind up with. So we're hovering around 22 and 24. And that's our steady state error. So at this stage, it is actually doing okay, but the problem is because we are maxing out, we need an integral to smooth that out. So I'll set that to 1 second and see how that turns out. This is actually causing oscillations. Let's try reducing this to 0.01. I am still getting severe issues, so no matter what I set this at, it does appear we're going to have oscillations. And in this particular case, you can't really tune this part without setting the derivative time. So I'm going to have to do that. I'm going to set this to 1 second, and I'm going to set the derivative time to something like, I don't know, 1 second, 1 second 10. Let's see, does it smooth this out? It does appear that having the derivative time set is smoothing it out. So basically, I have this set up. So for something like this, you definitely want a very high amount of thrust, and you want to have the integral time set to be, honestly, I don't know if this number really matters as much. Like, I don't know. To be honest, I'm not entirely certain. This could be, like, it will respond faster if you set this lower, but at the same time, setting this lower creates oscillations. And the derivative time is needed in order to stabilize the integral time and to reduce this instability that it has. So now we need to take a look. This thing is moving backwards and to the left, which means that even though we have this set, it is still having an error. Let's remove this. Let's remove these entirely. As we can see, we are rocking back and forth because of this. So we want to try to reduce that. Unfortunately, setting this to 1 second is causing massive oscillations. In fact, they're getting worse. Let's just set this derivative time to my go-to, which is setting the integral time to 1 second and having the derivative time slightly longer than that. If I check, it is probably not properly tuned, but it is stable for now. If I add any blocks to this, it's probably going to crash. And oh no, it's actually so massive. There we go, tilting forward. And it's recovering. There we go. And as we can see, it still, once it passes a certain threshold, it cannot keep balance. It gets overwhelmed. In this specific case, I would actually like to add the extra thrusters, again, because it increases the stability, and this craft desperately needs more stability. Could also improve it by having the these thrusters. You want these thrusters, you could use the larger thrusters, which would significantly improve it. Now in this case, it's probably a little overpowered. In fact, as we can see, we're getting oscillations with pitch, and we're getting no roll oscillations. So it tells us that our pitch has too much control. Since we're getting oscillations, we're going to lower this to 0.5. Let's see if that improves it. There is some overshoot. So I think increasing this time, this value, still getting oscillations. Will these oscillations go away? No. Let's set this to 1.5 then. The oscillations are going away. So now we have it set properly. So just following those rules, we can manage to set up the PID. Then if we add these, should be able to make this tower taller without it starting to tilt. In fact, now it just sinks to the ground. This is actually a really excellent example of how good this platform actually is. It's extremely stable now. No matter how much weight I put on it or how much offset I give it. In fact, I'm going to try doing this. In fact, we have less authority here. We're going to just start to sink instead of actually losing balance. So I would say that this is a very stable platform. Now, fun fact about this particular one, it only has so much fuel and it's about to drop to the ocean floor, so I'm not even going to remove it. Now I do have a couple additional examples just as demonstration, and I'm going to load them in. So I did mention like you can do it with 4 thrusters. This is it. This is how I did it. Now I'm pretty sure these PIDs are not perfectly tuned because again, like I made this when I didn't even know like how professionals tune PIDs, so it still is a little off, but I think I did fairly well with that. Oh, these are all the default settings. Oh, that's okay, that's actually like, except that I reduced the gain. Okay, that's actually kind of funny. But as you can see, this is the bare minimum. You can't have them in the corners, although I am going to test that real quick just to be sure. In fact, let me do that right now and I'll just confirm with you guys if it does work or not. And I'll just say on camera that I'm a derp if I was wrong about that. It does appear to be floating, but one of the issues that I'm getting is that pitch and roll fight each other, and it's because this rightmost thruster is a roll thruster and this leftmost thruster is a roll thruster, and basically what's happening is it's on this angle. It's pitching along this, like this side. So basically along this is how it tilts. And I can demonstrate that with a piece of lead. And what will happen is it will not properly recover because when it tries to roll, it's also affecting its pitch. Am I wrong? Oh, I am wrong? I am actually wrong. Okay then, well I'm just a derp and I'm not familiar with how these are properly set up. Yeah, it adjusts weirdly, but it still settles properly in the end. Okay, there you can have it in the corners, but it isn't going to be as effective as this, which I'm sure this also will destabilize, but this thing will just settle in a more natural way. Like much more quickly, because its roll isn't going to affect its pitch. Like, because as you could see with that, it had to like adjust and then adjust for its adjustment. But it does seem to actually work. So I was wrong. I was wrong about that. You can totally have just one on each corner. Okay, so I spawned in this really off-balance design earlier. As you can see, its center of mass is way off center. As you can tell, it's not centered, and our thrusters are not centered around center of mass. What I did was I increased the thrust in the front to help counter this center of mass. And it does actually work fairly well. I don't think the PID settings are really... I haven't configured them. This is just proof of concept. But it does settle into this position and hover, and you can tune this. One thing to note though is that pitch is going to be a little more difficult, and roll is going to be it's going to interfere a bit more with pitch. And that's something to keep in mind. I'm also going to show you an alternative way you could set this up in a moment. As you can see, it is floating. At this stage, I can just balance it, and it should actually be stable at this stage. So what I just did, and it is going to take quite a while for this to settle since it's default settings, is that I centered my center of thrust. I centered my thrusters around the center of mass. If I want to make this more stable, I can change these to be the roll thrusters so that the roll is actually directly on center of mass, and then they won't interfere with pitch. So as you can see, this platform is actually, aside from like issues with the actual PID tuning, this is a floating platform. It is stable. And because of the way this is set up and the fact that my thrusters are all centered around the center of mass, it is going to float, and it's going to be fairly stable. And it's going to have like this lightweight alloy all cantilevered, which is cool. And while that doesn't look like it can float, and in fact it is definitely having some issues, as I would need to increase the derivative and like give it more of a thing. In fact, this is annoying me. Let me fix pitch. Let me just increase the gain. Reduce this number because it's reducing its time to settle. And keep this the same since it seems to be dampening it actually perfectly. This should actually be properly where it should be, and it won't float away this time. Except it is slightly moving. Okay, that just bothered me. I had to fix it. But as you can see, even though it looks like basically these thrusters can cantilever this because the actual center of mass is right here. That's something to keep in mind. In your craft, it is going to be far easier to balance your craft if your thrusters are actually made with respect to the center of mass. If you don't have it like that, then you have issues like this where some thrusters have to be more powerful than others, which can work, and in fact this thing actually has perfectly stabilized itself at this point. But there's also like the issue that if it's center of mass, some thrusters are going to have to work harder than others, and since it can't naturally balance, you actually have to wait for it to properly settle, which means if things like bump it, it's going to have a harder time adjusting. Now there is one more example and I will just clear the screen real quick for that. So give me a moment and I'll just show it to you. But it does appear that I have it somewhat stable. Basically, this is an overdamped system. Compared to an underdamped system, this thing is going to basically oscillate a little bit. But it's going to maintain, but overall with the oscillations, it's going to maintain a certain altitude. And see, that kind of system's actually wanted because it keeps the platform from being as affected by the waves, although as you can see here, it clearly is affected by the waves, but it's very slight. The larger the craft, the easier it will be to balance, provided you have enough thrust, basically. This is the foray, and it uses PIDs to balance. I don't actually know what the exact settings are, and it won't actually do you any good to see it, because again, every ship is going to react differently to the waves. There will be two things to note though. When you are setting it up, aim for having a high amount of gain and a high amount of derivative time, but you need to make sure that it has a very little oscillation if possible, and you don't want its integral to be too long. So keep those in mind. You might be wondering what the smallest PID platform you can possibly get is. This is that. It is this. And its tuning is probably a little off, but I don't care because when it does settle, it is perfectly still. And it's perfectly balanced. And amusingly, it literally just uses a 2-block engine with a fuel tank. What tricker, you might say? This isn't the actual smallest size. This uses, I believe, it's 10 blocks. You could technically do it in 8 blocks. Well, yes, you can. And I will just show this off. But I would need to replace this battery. Now this is going to actually react very weirdly. It's very harsh. In fact, it's going to almost hit the water and then it's going to bounce up. This thing was a nightmare to tune for whatever reason. Having the thrusters out this far has made it very, very difficult. But there you go. This is technically the bare minimum size you can get with a floating platform. However, there's actually one other way to make a perfectly stable floating platform. And the smallest size is, I believe, 3 volume. Because I count the height. And it's actually, you don't make it this way. Here's how you do this. It would be new object, fortress, and then you just put a wood block on it. And if I take a look at this, there we go. It's perfectly stabilized. You don't need anything. And it will slowly drain power. And if you remove that block, suddenly you have just a 2-block large thing. Its volume, it's its volume is 2. And that is the technical smallest floating stable platform you could possibly ever get. Okay, jokes aside, I hope you found this tutorial actually helpful. And any feedback you can give me is welcome, actually. I will actually leave a link to the PID Wikipedia page in the description so that you can kind of see the material that I was looking at. I'll even link directly to the part about manual tuning, which oddly they say requires a professional, but I just kind of winged it for the longest time. And I hope you all have a good day. See ya.